Hey, welcome to Fluketronic. Up now we're going to take another look at this concept for playing the copper flute called anchor points. Now I presented this a couple of years ago, but recently got some questions on that original video and the chart in that original video, and realized that I probably didn't explain it as well as I could have or should have. And the chart last time, I can see how that was maybe a little confusing too. So we're going to take another look at that and see if this helps. Okay, now this concept will work on any key of copper flute. There are three keys now. There's the low C was the first one. I have a low D that we're going to be using today. And then there are actually two keyed in F. There's a high F called the lullaby edition, and then the bass F. This technique will work on all of them. And the chart I'm going to show you, you can use whichever flute you have. We're going to use the D today, so we'll be using note names on the D, but the chart will have all the information for all three types. So let's just review what this concept is. Now, first of all, if you look at the website for the fingering chart, Eric has fingering charts now for the low C and F. Curiously, there's not one for the D, but the fingerings are all the same. It's just the note names that are a little different. So I'm going to start by calling the holes by a note name. Now we're on the D, so I want you to think as you're lifting fingers one after the other, and all the way to the thumb hole in the back. If you give a name to each hole, and the name I'm going to give it means this is the note you get if you close that hole and all holes above it, right? So if you have all holes closed, that's going to give you the D note. If you raise your pinky, that's going to be your E note, and so forth. So if you keep raising the fingers, your notes are going to be D, E, F, F sharp, G, A, B flat, B, all fingers off would be C. Okay, now you don't really play the copper flute like that because, as you'll notice, I've got supported on the shoulder. If I try to do that while I'm holding it, I'm going to drop the flute because you need some support. And that's the whole point of this technique, is that you need some anchor points in order to stabilize the flute and hold it while you're playing. So there are four combinations of anchor points that you can use. Now your bottom hand anchor points is either going to be your middle finger or your ring finger. Your top hand anchor points are either going to be index finger or middle finger. Right? So you got two on the bottom, two on the top, 2 times 2 is 4. So you have 4 different combinations of anchor points. And those are going to give you different scales and modes of those scales. So that's the point of this technique, is that you don't have to remember all those names. Now I'm going to kind of give you all the note names and the scale names and so forth, but you don't have to know all that. You can. That's just kind of for those of you that are really interested in music theory. You might want to know that detail, but you don't have to know all that in order to play. All right, so to get into this, I'm going to turn the camera vertical so that you can kind of see the notes as I'm playing them, and we'll kind of go over what anchor points is all about. So back in a sec. All right, so let's present the chart here and don't get overwhelmed. So let's just take a look at the second row up from the bottom. Now, if you read across the row there, you can kind of see if I'm holding a low C, that would be the D note. I'm holding the low D, so this is the E note. And the first column there, top, middle, bottom ring. So what I'm going to do here is I want to use top middle finger, bottom ring finger for that entire column. Now, what does that mean? So you're going to choose a root note from the left-hand column. So let's say I want to choose E, right? So pinky's off. So that's the note E. What scale am I going to get with this anchor point? Well, it's going to be a minor scale. The name happens to be Aeolian. Doesn't matter. You don't have to know that. But that is the scale you will get if you use that E as your root note. Keep your anchor points and let all the other fingers kind of do what they want to do, right? So you can play, whoops, play up and down the scale, including the pinky, or including the thumb hole, keeping your anchor points, and you will get an E minor scale. So let's see what that sounds like. Right? Very familiar, standard E minor scale. Now, the column is, what that is showing you is that if you choose a different root note with the same anchor point, you're going to get a different scale. Again, you don't have to really know the names of those different scales. I kind of color-coded it to let you know what kind of scale you're going to get. So for example, let's say we started with all holes covered as our root note. What scale are you going to get? Well, it's going to be a D major, happens to be called Mixolydian, but that doesn't matter. So let's start with that as our root note and see what that sounds like. All right, pretty much familiar as a major scale. Now, it's not your typical major scale. That would be called the Ionian mode. So to get a real major scale, you really have to go up to the middle of the chart. And you see there on the D flute, this would be G major Ionian. So if you wanted to play kind of your normal major scale, you would actually start with the left hand. That would be all holes down on the left hand. That would be your root note. So let's see what that sounds like. And the notes work in the upper octave too. So we'll try and go up and get the whole octave using some of the upper octave notes too. And if you're playing the D or the F, it's going to be harder to get higher on the flute. So you saw as I was getting up to the top of that G scale, I wasn't getting that top note too well. Sometimes I can, sometimes not as much. So you do have to keep that in mind here, how high you can go, but the anchor points technique is the same. Okay, so what's up with all of the little icons there? So depending on which mode you play and how weird you want to get, that's what's going on there. So the kind of standard scales are going to be the banana icons. So that's your natural minor or your natural major is going to be kind of just the normal scales that you're used to. Once you get off of those modes, it's going to get a little weirder and weirder. So, for example, I showed you the major Mixolydian on the bottom. That's kind of weird because if it was a real C major, you would have to get a D major for this. You need a high C sharp, and you don't have that on the copper flute. So that is one of the limitations of this flute, is it's not fully chromatic. You can kind of get some of those notes I've talked about in other videos with half holing and some cross fingering techniques. But those are kind of advanced techniques for what we're talking about today. So you really can't get that, say, a D major Ionian or the regular D major. You cannot get that because you don't have that high C sharp note. But you can get very close, right? So the D Mixolydian I showed you. So that high note there would actually be a half step higher if it was Ionian mode. Okay, so anyway, so if you read down that column, we've got two kind of banana scales, very mild. We've got two olive scales. We got a major Mixolydian, and then the A minor Dorian. Right, so if I'm starting from 2 fingers as my root note, then I'll get a minor scale, in this case an A minor scale, with a little bit of flavor. All right, so that's your kind of medium spice, if you will. Now, what's up with the peppers? All right, so in this column, we've got a B minor Phrygian mode in the second row there. So that is going to be starting from the B note. Now, I should have said something at the start about the note names, because as I went up the note names, this one is special, right? So it's basically the anchor point we've been talking about. So the only holes closed on the flute are the back thumb hole and middle finger here. On the D flute, that is actually the B note, and if we use that as our anchor, we'll get a B Phrygian scale, which most of the notes are going to be below the root, so there you go. Okay, so that's kind of cool with that little half step at the beginning. So that's a little bit spicy. The major Lydian in the first one is kind of the same way. Now that one's interesting because your root note is the top of the flute, so you only get a couple of notes in the second octave, but most of the scale is going to be below. So let's try that. So this would be C major Lydian on the D flute. All right, and that leaves one left for the, what would be F sharp here, minor Locrian. All right, so that's going to be using this as the root note. Let's see what that sounds like. Okay, so that is a F sharp minor Locrian. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a flavor of what we're talking about, that you're using the same anchor points, but depending on where you start and treat as your root note, you can get very different flavors of scales. And as long as you kind of consult the chart that, oh, I've got a minor scale, it's going to be a little flavorful or more flavorful, you can kind of get a feel for what mode you want to play for a given exercise or given song. All right, so that's it for the first anchor point. Now we got 4 more to go through. I don't think I'll go through the entire chart here, but just to give you a sense of each column. Okay, so the second one is going to be top index finger and bottom middle. All right, so a little bit different. This is going to be on Eric's fingering charts is If you had a C flute, this would be your C minor scale. So this is going to be your normal minor scale from the bottom of the flute. So very useful to know. So let's start there. This is D flute. So this is going to be D minor Aeolian. All right, so that's C minor Aeolian. But again, you can choose the starting point to be any other root note in that scale, and you'll get major or minor according to the chart there. So let's just get a sense of, let's say you wanted to play, say, E flat or F major Ionian, right? So this is going to be your standard, well, it'll be F major on the D flute. All right. So we'll leave the rest of the second column there to play with. Now let's go to the next anchor point. So it says top middle and bottom middle. All right, so this one is, you get your standard major is from the top, right? So this is actually, if you want to get C major Ionian, you can get it here. All right, so starting, yeah, here. All right, so this kind of gives you a little bit of the power of this technique. So we talked about the first anchor points. You don't really have a C major, a normal C major scale. But if you wanted a normal C major scale, you could get it with this anchor point. All right, so I'll let you explore the rest of those as well. Now, there is a fourth anchor point that is pretty weird, and all the scales there are pretty weird. So here we go, top index, bottom ring. All right, now the bass scale here is really the one in the middle there, which would be G minor, melodic minor. So that's kind of starting from here, and let's just see what that sounds like. Yeah, so as I said in the original video, the melodic minor is kind of weird because you get kind of a half and half feel. Like from here, your left hand feels like a kind of normal minor, and if you go down, it feels more like a major scale, or up. Kind of feels more like a major scale. So you get that kind of half and half feel, and that's really true of all of these modes. I've given you the names of these modes, which I had to look up preparing for this video. So these are things that, unless you're really into some jazz modes or just bizarre classical modes, you're not going to probably know these modes or use them all that often. But if you're really looking for an exotic feel, this will give it to you. All right. So again, you've got some different flavors of major or minor. So let's say you wanted, and probably some of these could have used 4 or 5 peppers. Some of them are not so weird. Like let's look at the bottom one, major Mixolydian flat 6. So in this case, this is going to be a D major scale, kind of sort of. So let's see what that is like. That's not too weird, really. So let's try the one purple one here. Major question mark, four peppers, Super Locrian. Boy, what is that? Okay, so I'm going to start. This is the root. All right. Obviously, we didn't cover everything on the chart, so there's lots to explore here. And obviously, other ways you can play the copper flute. You don't have to be stuck to these scales either. But this is a way, just unlocks a lot of different ways to play without thinking about it a whole lot. Again, just throw out the bottom line, Dorian, Phrygian, all that kind of stuff. Throw all that out, and you got a lot to play with. Now let's talk about some other ways. How can you use this chart? So let's say there's probably more ways than this, but let's say you had a backing track in the key of D minor, let's say. So you've got a D minor backing track. That's pretty common. Well, you can look on the chart here, and where do I have D minor scale? I've got a D flute, so where do I have D minor? Well, here's one. We talked about the regular D minor. Now, I also have a D minor Dorian, right? So I've got two ways I can play a D minor scale depending on which anchor point system I want to use. So not a whole lot of options there. What if I wanted an A minor backing track? Again, very common to find A minor backing tracks. Well, now I've got 4 different ways I could play an A minor scale. I can do the regular minor Aeolian if I use the 3rd anchor point, or I can get a little bit spicy with the Dorian, Phrygian, or the Dorian flat 2nd, right? So depending on which anchor point I pick, coming from that A root note, I can get as spicy as I want. And you can even mix and match, right? So if you kind of forget which anchor point you're using, kind of doesn't matter if you're in A minor, right? Just pick one and then pick another one, and it should all work. So that's pretty cool. Now, and again, you can kind of use that. So like, let's say you wanted to play C major. You got 4 options for C major and so forth. Now, another way you could look at this is, well, what flute do I want to use? I've got a C flute. This is a D flute. I also have C flutes. So let's say, again, let's go back to that D minor example. Say, well, I want to play D minor. Well, I can use the D flute. I've got a couple options there. If I want to use the 2nd row up, D, I've got 4 other options with the C flute, right? So you can kind of use this. Well, which flute do I want to use? I have more options for D minor with the C flute than I do actually with the D flute. Interesting. So, you know, there's a way to pick a backing track, pick which flute, which mode you want to use. Okay, so I think we'll leave it at that today. If you think of something I've left out, let me know in the comments. Any questions about the chart, or if you see another way to use the chart, let me know that, and we'll maybe make another video on it. So I hope that was useful, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks.